Hey everybody, it's Tom. I just wanted to briefly introduce this interview with Camaren Peter about his book, Lazarus in the Multiple, Awakening to the Era of Complexity, Surviving the Anthropocene. So I had a subtitle and a subtitle to the subtitle. It was really just a delightful exchange that I had with Camaren. Fortunately, the recording kicked in literally just a few seconds after the interview started, so you missed the first part. The leading question was simply for him to say, I asked him, who is Lazarus? What is the multiple? And, it picks up right where he's beginning his response saying, well, Lazarus is. In any event, I hope you enjoyed the conversation, and I'll catch you guys later.
Every man of modernity, who I'm trying to understand, whose place in the world I'm trying to understand. And it really comes out of my own experiences in a post-apartheid South Africa, where as we entered into our new democracy, we went through a significant lull in activism. And this was in complete contrast to the upbringing I had. I grew up in a highly politicized society that was asking questions of everything around it. And, I grew up as a little child going from community meeting to worker meetings to political meetings pretty much every second day of the week. And in the 90s, after we found our freedom, it was almost as if suddenly there was nothing left to do but get a good job and make money. And there was a profound lack of activism in our society. Most of the activists who were at grassroots level in South Africa, a lot of people I grew up around, all went up into government. And some of them obviously stayed outside and dedicated their time to civil society. But a lot of the senior leaders in the communities actually got taken up into government. And there was a sense that we had lost effectively what Hannah Arendt would call the polis, the space of political action in our society. And I started reflecting on that. I was quite depressed in the 1990s because I thought we'd reached a point where we would never really be a politically active society in any meaningful way again. And that started to change from about 2005 upwards, when until now, where serious political changes are starting to unfold in South Africa. But what I was concerned with is how we had entered into the world that we'd always aspired to being a part of, the global international community, but we had lost our sense of purpose. And so Lazarus for me is that every man of modernity who is caught within systems that they have to service, or Lazarus has to service, but within which he or she doesn't really have the kind of power to change society anymore. And I suppose it's partly a frustration with the neoliberal end of history at the same time, that I started to really think through what was the condition of the 21st century that Lazarus was facing, and why was Lazarus seemingly lost, unable to really find expression and to take action about things that are really important to us around the world. And I don't want to go into great detail, but everything from climate change to human trafficking are things that we should have been dealing with 50 years ago, if not even longer, but we still struggle to take effective action. And I started to try and understand Lazarus' condition without necessarily adopting an ideology as a starting point.
You've already said a lot, and you haven't really even turned to the question of the multiple explicitly. But a few things sort of strike me in what you've said so far. One is, especially your last remark about how these are issues which really were relevant even 50, perhaps even longer ago. And what that designates is that Lazarus is not just sort of a child of the 21st century, but something that emerges far earlier. Modernity is a condition which really predates the story, So
Absolutely.
It's useful to sort of understand that historically we're more than just children of the moment, but the capacity perhaps to appreciate that um, circumstance is impaired maybe by the context in which we find ourselves, where the rate at which information is sort of presented to us in an almost aleatory manner invites us to a fractured sense of temporality that puts us at a distance from this historical context to which you are alluding.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, I see a lot of the oppressions as occurring in cycles, and even people who are oppressed can perpetuate oppression because they themselves are abused and start to work through that abuse by actually exercising it on other people. It might be a controversial view, but critically, the multiple for me is a metaphor really for understanding the kind of modern world we're living, where the rates of change around us are staggeringly much faster than they ever were before. They're more nonlinear and surprising than they've ever been before. So we're in a world which is essentially where we're just keeping up with the changes and with the challenges we face, even in our personal lives, just earning a living and paying the bills. But also internally, I think there's a reflection of that multiple where we are so overwhelmed with the amounts of information that it can actually be quite disabling. So in terms of, you know, many different ways of looking at it, not just the kind of information overload inside of us, but the struggles with identity and struggles with finding peace and clarity in the modern world is also very much an internal affair. So what was relevant for me about the multiple, and it's not my idea, you know, I counted it in the writings of a philosopher named Michel Serres, and it resonated so strongly with me that he defined the multiple in terms of an ocean, but refused to put it into a category. You know, he says it's neither a flock nor a I can't remember the exact quote, but you know, the kinds of terms people use to describe the complexity of the world, you know, in terms of flocking and swarming, and he says it's not any of this. It's actually not something that we can put into those kinds of discrete descriptions, and perhaps we missed the point when we try to do that. So for me, it's kind of like the ocean. You know, where there's huge amounts of variation, but there are some patterns and there are some signals to which we can hold on to and get some understanding through.
So maybe you could talk more, or flesh out the notion just a bit more of the multiple. What struck me about the metaphors to which you alluded, even though they were rejected, like the metaphor of the flock or the swarm, is that there's a sense, even with a flock or a swarm, of a collective sensibility that unites its motion. And even with the metaphor of the ocean, there's a kind of coherence to the ocean as a unity. But I'm wondering,
Yes.
what I'm wondering is, you're saying the signal is the notion of what does in fact lend thematic cohesiveness to this indeterminate mass, the multiple, but it's difficult to actually connect with that signal in virtue of the almost dissonant manner in which we encounter it. Is that it? Like, is dissonance a part of how we would approach an apprehension of the concept?
Oh, it's essentially multiplicity. So what resonated for me with complexity theory is the notion of emergence. And, you know, emergence can be thought of as stuff happening in a system which works in a kind of, in a non-linear way, but still is mechanistic and produces complex behaviors.
Like
but
weather?
The other way of, you know, the other way of understanding emergence, which I found really intriguing and I've made a lot of use of in my work, is that depending on how you look at the system, what filters or lenses you apply to it, you see it differently. And so that's what fascinates me about the multiple, is if you want to look at it as a flock, it'll be a flock. If you want to look at it as a swarm, it'll be a swarm. But essentially, it escapes description because it is something that we are a part of, but can only ever have partial understanding of. We can only have a fragmented, partial view of it because by nature of how we observe things, we apply frameworks, we apply lenses, we apply filters. And so whenever we observe it, we are reducing it in some way, and hence we never get to terms with its full complexity. And that's okay to live with. It's kind of a quantum mechanics view at the same time.
It struck me there. It sort of helped clarify I think for me what you're driving. And so whether that clarification is actually has happened, maybe made evident by this question, because it seems that if you look at modernity, if by modernity we say we take Descartes or Galileo as a point of departure, the real hope of that sort of early science and physics was the establishment of an objective universe, like a singular truth, right? So there is a manner in which there's almost a belief that the truth itself is aperspectival. Of course, it didn't take so long before it was appreciated that there were deep problems with that view, and by the time you get to the middle 19th century, you have adumbrations of that appreciation, which it is sort of some 20th century thinkers sort of fleshed out, right? Yeah. But when you come back to the question of what is the challenge which Lazarus faces in dealing with the multiple, would you say it's that Lazarus, as the everyman in modernity, is yet clinging to an unduly singular way of approaching the truth, of one which doesn't fully apprehend, perhaps a la Kant, that there's an enormous perspectival contribution that we make to our relationship with reality?
Absolutely, and I think Lazarus is, it's not just looking for singular truths in terms of scientific truths or political truths or ideological truths. It's also at the level of identity, and breaking down the idea that there's a fixed, solid identity to any human being. We all exercise different. We are different in different relations, in different relationships, in different situations, different contexts. I'm a father, I'm a son, I'm a partner. I'm not an employee anymore. In different contexts, I have different identities. I mean, even while I'm in this interview, there's a certain hat I'm wearing. Which would be very different if we were having a beer at a bar.
Right. Right.
So I think that's one way of understanding it as beyond just looking for singular truths. And I think where it resonates with things like assemblage theory is they would be against any idea of essences, but also against the idea of organic wholes. So in the case of the multiple and the fact that when we observe it with different filters, we see it differently, that kind of emergence is essentially expressing that there is no organistic whole either, as well as no singular essence through which we can describe the phenomenon.
It's very slippery. It's actually, it sounds rather Buddhistic, actually, the whole idea of not self or no self. But that's sort of an extrinsic possible coincidence.
No, it's not a coincidence at all. In fact, I'm not a practicing Buddhist, but my first encounters with philosophy was essentially through Chinese and Indian philosophy in my teen years. It was later when I started studying physics that I started reading, Western philosophy. And so I found a huge gap in Western philosophy until I encountered really deconstruction and the theories that come after it. So, yes, in some ways you could frame it according to Buddhist ontologies, absolutely, and I've researched those, and I'm unashamedly confessing to it, because I think there is a sense, or there's there's a need to validate and legitimize ourselves in terms of Western academic thought and its project, even Western philosophy. And I think one of the key statements about Lazarus is incontrovertibly defined by the duality of existence. And if you read my book carefully, you'll see that I keep coming back to this concept of duality, because in Western sort of philosophy and understanding, you know, there is a tendency to sort of pay lip service to, you know, whether it's Derrida's undecidable or Plato's included middle as expressing duality. But when it comes to making it practical in everyday life, which Buddhism does, there's an avoidance. So, I mean, I remember having a discussion about a paper by Max Neef, who's a Nobel Prize winner, a paper on transdisciplinarity with one of my colleagues. And it was a group discussion, actually. And at some point, he said, you know, but towards the end of the paper, he started talking about the included middle. And I don't know what he was smoking then. And kind of casually dismissed it. And I thought, well, that's the most important part. And if we're going to talk about complexity, then we need to acknowledge and talk about duality. I mean, I suppose it's strongly informed by my own studying of physics, you know, where you can't escape duality. You can't escape the fact that light is a wave and a particle at the same time, and these are contradictory categories. So, you know, similarly, I wanted to try and find a way of exploring the various dualities, you know, modern man faces.
And I think just to sort of stay with that duality for a moment before it's sort of turning to sort of more questions of so-called application, it's striking, you know, it's like, it's almost like, it's not particularly difficult to see how by applying different lenses to external situations, how we see the situation is going to change. Mm-hmm. But I think where the real power emerges is understanding that the consequence of that filter, or the consequences of that filter or lens, are going to flow along two lines. They're going to affect how you see the situation, but they're also going to ramify for how you understand yourself, even if you're not sort of consciously aware of what's going on dialectically. And so you have to sort of, the power is appreciating how the shifts and the change in any given situation can emerge from either, and really from both of those poles. And it might be actually easier, I think you're suggesting, if I'm hearing you correctly, to deal with that modularity if you let go of the idea that there's a hard distinction between them. Is that what
Absolutely.
you say? Is that fair?
And so, yeah, and I mean, I sorry.
It's okay.
I was fascinated. Yeah. Sorry, I was fascinated by Derrida's, you know, use of the undecidable as the ultimate, you know, duality, the zombie, which is dead and alive at the same time. And what appealed to me is, you know, when I read about him and his history and his refusal to write a PhD thesis in philosophy using conventional philosophical methodologies, because he didn't want to construct an argument around one metaphysical opposite in reaction to the other, you know. So he actually resisted going into dualism and using that as a starting point. And I thought that was fascinating. And I suppose that's why a lot of his work, and I'm by no means an expert on it, resonated so strongly with me. And that was my in, I suppose, into Western philosophy.
Right. I must confess that my familiarity with Derrida at this point still remains sort of secondhand. But what you're saying also reminds me of certain elements of what I really took from Camus' thought, where he has this notion, you know, one of my favorite quotes or remarks of Camus is, which actually I think is relevant to what we're discussing here, is that integrity needs no rules. And the way this comes out in his writing, especially his sort of nonfiction, is that you have to ultimately reject the idea of ever having the convenience of the absolute. As soon as you have the convenience of the absolute and that certitude, you have actually closed off your capacity to engage life, right? And so there's a tension, and you have to learn to abide within that tension. And the word tension is like a strong, almost uncomfortable word, and perhaps we can move to a space where we don't have to indulge it or use it. But I think that there's a possible point of connection there. But I find, by the way, just to prove it, I'm always so happy when I hear about. I didn't know that about Derrida, right? But the great minds always do this, right? Like everyone was outraged when Einstein published his paper without crediting anybody. It's like, who is this guy? He works at a patent office, and he's or Saul Kripke only got his undergrad. He's never gotten, he revolutionized lots of stuff in analytic thought. So that's always great when people say, look, the heck with it. I'm not going to work within your institutional framework, right? Or, a duality, a hard duality. So, which the two correlate. So, which
absolutely.
Go ahead.
People like that are caught in if you think of a statistical distribution, I think of them as caught in the line rings of the distribution. They're not the norms. They're the non-linearities, which only actually become significant when the conditions change. And by the way, I'm reading The Myth of Sisyphus at the moment, and I'm absolutely loving it. I'm a big fan of Albert Camus, even though I haven't read all his work.
Right. No, that's a great one. I actually recently finished The Rebel, which is a sequel to The Myth of Sisyphus. So, but that's just a great little gem, right? But let's see if we can bring it back to the concrete and what's going on in the domains of politicality and the student movement, right? In South Africa. And actually, those are the two most on your blog there, the two most recent blog posts. One about the perpetuity, the perpetual success of the ANC. It's the imperfections notwithstanding, and then the other about the tension within academia around student movement toward sort of free education. And actually, it's just I'll turn it over to you. I was struck at the level of analogies between what's going on there, what's going on here in the U.S., right? Which I don't think is an accident. I think that what a lot of, it's complex. You don't want to push the analogy too far, right? You don't want to say one is the same as the other. But there are certain sort of shared structural features economically, which I think conduce to creating those analogies. But we can get into that in a few more conversational paragraphs. Let me just ask, how do you introduce people, say, for example, to the question of the student movement, and what are your thoughts on it? And then maybe we can sort of relate that to the issues of complexity as you see fit. So
okay, so I was really, really happy to see the students start to become active politically in South Africa. I see it as the first real serious effort in 21 years to re-energize the very active polis that I grew up in the South African spectrum. There's still a lot of problems with the movement. It hasn't really built the kind of broad-based support that we had in the 80s, lots and lots of civil society organizations all coming together, struggling and fighting against apartheid with a very unified voice, even though they had very disparate sort of interests and even agendas amongst them. But I think, first off, I should say I'm a strong supporter of the student movement. I'm also highly critical of it because I think, it needs to be thought through properly. It can't just be a once-off event, an expression of political outrage, and then we all move on and it recedes and becomes irrelevant. I want to see a sustained momentum. But essentially, South African students, I became a student in 1993, which is 1 year before our first democratic election. And we all had a strong belief, and we were promised by the ANC that, education would be free, And a lot of the ideals which were laid out in what is our Freedom Charter, which all those organizations came together around and agreed on, it was the unifying document, that, the ANC would follow through on that. But, as soon as they came into power, it very quickly became clear that, we were at the end of history. Neoliberalism seemed to be the kind of way the world was going. And for a range of very pragmatic sort of reasons, the ANC went along with a straight up neoliberal program. We deregulated, deliberalized in 1996. We put our money into large deals, arms deals, for example, which all ended up being corrupt. And things like free education were sacrificed. So there is free education in South Africa at primary and at secondary schooling levels. But university education and tertiary education at technicons, for example, was not free. So my generation ended up, largely saddled by debt. A lot of people who were transitioning from working class into the middle class found it very difficult. And to cut a long story short, when I saw the students come out with very similar demands as we had when we demonstrated and protested in 1995, for example, 94 and 95, it resonated so strongly because I felt like we hadn't moved forward. But yet the aspirations of South African youth were still the same. The expectations were still the same. And I thought this is a time, if they push hard enough, they can bring about the kind of changes that we need, sort of rejuvenate the political sphere and set a new trajectory for it, just through the sheer force of, the youth bulge, which exists not just in South Africa, but across Africa. So in terms of the other part of your question, though, there are linkages across the world, the Occupy movement, for one, whether we go back to the Battle of Seattle, has had a large influence around the world in terms of how people organize, how they communicate. And so for me, it's a breakdown in the traditional hierarchies. So the word I use is heterarchy, which is more of a flattened hierarchy, where under certain conditions, certain hierarchies get established, but it's fluid. It's not necessarily cast in stone. It's not like some of your old school communist or apartheid bureaucracies, Heterarchy enables us to communicate, for example, through the technologies provided by the information economy. And I hate to break it down to something as simple as cell phones, but this has made a huge difference in Africa in general, where mobile penetration is so high. So youth have been able to exchange thoughts, exchange messages, exchange agendas, have discussions. And I don't think that there's any kind of coincidence, for example, between the Roads Must Fall demonstrations which started up the road from me at the University of Cape Town and similar kind of protests in I think, Oxford and Cambridge. Universities are well connected with each other. Students are, as well as lecturers, and experiences get shared more easily between them, not just physically by them sitting around a table, but through all the technologies that are available to us right now. So, I see that as a valuable opportunity. I think I've lost you. Hello?
Oh, hello. Oh dear.
Hi, I'm here. Can you hear me? I can't see you. That's all. I've just lost visual on you.
I can hear you. Oh dear. Hello.
No, I cannot.
Hello? You have me back.
Yes, good.
All right. Sorry about that. I
Cool.
actually
Shall I
could hear
just-
you the entire time, so
Oh,
I didn't
okay.
lose anything on my end. There's just a hiccup there.
No problem. Should I
Happily,
just
I think, well, you, well, I have some things, but go ahead and finish your point.
Okay, yeah, just on the student movement, there are various aspects of the framework for understanding complexity that I use, which apply to it. For example, just simple things like nonlinearity and surprise as emergence. No one ever expected the student movement to basically, hold the South African government hostage and have its demands met at the end of last year. It was momentous. It was like something we hadn't experienced since the 70s or some critical events in the 80s and the early 90s, where, the students marched upon, almost overnight. They were demonstrating at the universities, and pretty much one of the days they marched on Parliament and went to the gates of Parliament and broke through and occupied the parliamentary grounds. Then later on, they marched to the Union buildings in Pretoria, which was, a huge sort of seat of legislature, and basically surrounded it. There were police everywhere, and there were little riots going on, but they managed to hold it hostage, and they brought about a moment where kind of non-linear change occurs. This is what emergence is. It's something that surprises you. But also in terms of self-organization, they were able to organize without necessarily having single leaders or ideologies. They were able to organize around their own particular agendas, but come together over key issues that they all believed in. But I think, another sort of, when we talk of undecidability, where they're caught between, caught in a space where decision-making becomes difficult because there are polar opposite contradictory issues that need to be resolved, I think that was also encountered by the student movement at a later stage, especially this year, where it's been struggling to find a clear voice, struggling with its leaderlessness, struggling with its very disparate and sometimes opposing ideologies. So there's a lot of value in the framework of complexity that I put forward in the book. And the essential difference between it and other frameworks is that most other frameworks of complexity are derived from systems theory. So they take, in my view, what is a very mechanistic worldview. They try to look at the mechanisms that drive complexity. My approach is very different. It looks at the properties that define complex systems. And from that, you can derive the mechanisms and all that. So I'm looking for more of a global perspective on complexity. For example, sorry?
I was just going to point out, in terms of like unexpected, eruptive change, besides for the example there, you can also look at what, the so-called Arab Spring.
Yes.
That, began in Tunisia, or there were things, here in the U.S., not quite at the same level, but, a few years ago, Wisconsin, in opposition to Governor Scott Walker's efforts to expropriate the public sector of their capacity to serve trade on block or whatever. There was a great uprising in that connection as well. Yes. Or Occupy, right? But then arises the issue that you say now that the students in South Africa are facing. You have an initial impulse and burst, which is very powerful, but then the sustenance of that perhaps becomes difficult, especially if you're connecting yourself in terms of a leaderless model. There's a lack of coherence among the contributing ideologies that can hamper forward movement. So you're saying, let's look at the complexity which permits these sorts of surprising and ultimately encouraging events to reveal themselves. Let's look at the properties of that, and perhaps from those properties, can we derive how we can translate these incursions, these events, into catalysts for a more stable movement forward. It's kind of paradoxical because you're talking about moving forward, but actually what stabilize that movement.
My perspective on this is born out of very real life experience of growing up in the 1980s, where the different racial groups, as well as broad-based, lots of different civil society organizations, from churches all the way through to grassroots women's groups, had to come together in order to make a concerted effort against apartheid. Now, apartheid was a clear enemy. So it was easy to get some principles that we could all agree on. And there were very disparate groups in this broad-based coalition, societal coalition. And there were many debates, and there were groups that were sidelined. There were there were definitely contested positions. But I think what's critical about having a space like that is what Hannah Arendt talks about as what is freedom. She says the lost treasure of freedom remains nameless. And that's because freedom is actually exists, in her definition. Freedom is the ability to act in concert with one another. And so she saw the space of participation where people could express and discuss and debate political ideas as more important than taking the state and administering power through the state. And what I find very valuable about that is that what we actually have with the student movements and what was actually there with the Arab Spring, and the moment could be lost, it's a very real threat, is that what you have is a space to be able to envision society as you want it anew. And I think that is real freedom. The first part of freedom is being able to think about society and to ask all the difficult questions about it. And the second part of freedom is actually being able to change it, as Zizek puts it. But for me, what's important about these protest movements, whether it's Occupy or whether it's the Arab Spring or whether it's the student movement in South Africa, it's becoming a student worker movement now, is that there's a space to discuss and envision the kind of society we want, and so it opens up the space for something new to emerge. And I think the kinds of leaders you need are not populists and ideologues in that circumstance. What you need is leaders who are facilitators, who are sensitive to this process and can encourage it and grow it and shape it and form it. And that requires a lot more sensitivity than just getting up, on the podium and making a radical speech.
Giving a speech. I just want to sort of build on your allusion to Hannah Arendt, who influenced another guy, Murray Bookchin. I don't know if you're very acquainted with Bookchin. For most of his life, he was an anarchist. Toward the end, he sort of renounced the label anarchist in lieu of the label communitarian because of his concerns with what he called lifestyle anarchism, where the rhetoric of resistance to authority was being deployed to sort of defend a kind of solipsism, which was at odds with the deeper history of anarchism as a profoundly socially aware movement, connected. But he was influenced by Hannah Arendt and sort of on the sort of built on her concept of the polis, distinguishing the state as being actually apolitical or anti-political. Because what the state does is it provides a framework of top-down imposition, which is at odds with the spirit of conversation, which is what actual political existence is.
Absolutely.
And so, what we call politicians are really just operators facilitating the institutional framework of the state. And we need to sort of reject that principle and reimagine what real political engagement is. And he actually goes back to Aristotle and the idea of man as a political creature, the zoon politikon. And what you're talking about in terms of what emerges with the student movements around the world and certain worker movements, there's some things that are happening in Greece, things that are happening in Detroit, is that the political space is emerging anew, right? But it puts itself almost necessarily at direct odds with the institutional frameworks that we inherit, because the very logic of those frameworks is to impose a control and a silence, and a simplification which reality simply will not abide. Which actually, when you think about it, is incredibly encouraging, right? You're like, well, reality can't abide tyranny because it's just more complicated than anything tyranny can handle. So, but
that's a great way
anyway,
of putting it, and it's actually the subject of the book I'm busy with at the moment. My observation of change in South Africa has been, instrumental in my worldview. So, even though we managed to create this, this transition to democracy, peaceful in inverted commas transition to democracy without all-out revolution, but we were able to take the state, and like the good Marxist-Leninists within the ANC and within a lot of the other groups thought, well, we're gonna administer change to the state, and we're gonna create a different kind of society. And yes, we have created a different kind of society. I mean, I won't pretend that the kind of society we live in now is anything like the kind of society I grew up in the 1980s. But when it comes to the state and how it exercises power, when it comes to institutions throughout society, the thing that is the hardest is how they perpetuate the same kind of logics that existed under apartheid. And it doesn't matter who it is, whether it's a black person or a white person occupying a position in these bureaucracies, they end up acting in the way. And so that has fascinated me, and it's what has made me, I suppose, so critical of leftist ideology, which I was raised on. I was really raised by proper, radical lefties, grassroots activists. But over time, I started to interrogate it for myself, much the same way as like a Tony Judd did.
So, I mean, that phenomenon actually is interesting because I think if you end up reading The Rebel, Camus actually raises concerns with precisely this problem with the left. The way he puts it is that there's a tension between rebellion and revolution, where when you rebel, it's not simply an act of negation, it's an act of affirmation. You're making a statement about human nature. It's fundamentally positive. The problem with many revolutions is that they lose touch with the fact that in that issue of rebellion, you're also making a positive statement about the oppressor. You're trying to bring both people out of that demeaning relationship. But instead of living in the tension which would permit that sort of mutual emancipation, there's a devolvement. And that devolvement is actually nihilism, which betrays the spirit of authentic rebellion.
Absolutely.
So it's a problem which haunts the left, and other people have addressed it, not just Camus. It just happened to be fresh in my mind, and so I was able to sort of bring him to bear there in connection with the issue that you're raising. It's the problem of authoritarianism. More generally.
Absolutely.
So all that being said, and you bring it up in an academic context where you find people who are well-intentioned, sincerely proffering, sympathy with the student movement and so forth. But then all of a sudden, when the chips are down, there's a kind of deference to a certain cynicism, like, well, what are you going to do about it, right? So I guess there's two questions that can be asked in that connection. Like, what do you think sort of precipitates that? And then how do you get people to move out of it?
Well, the first question is much easier to answer.
Okay.
Once you become part of the establishment and you become part of its procedures and you adopt its norms, it becomes part of the language that informs how you think and how you express yourself. So, I have great sympathy for a lot of the academics who are admittedly struggling with the complexities of the student movement, because they are actually in favor of what the students are arguing for. But they are part of a system, which is a global system, which they feel a strong need to service so as to keep up what they call academic standards. But at the same time, there's a tension with government, which is government has been cutting their funding since 1994, drastically. So they're forced to go out there and find money from the private sector and from donors. And so they are afraid that government is using this as a precedent to gain more control over them. And there have been efforts made by our government to gain control over what we call Chapter 9 institutions, which are independent institutions like the judiciary, and, a range of other things. So they see themselves as coming under a bit of threat because, they might be forced to make certain compromises to government and come under its control. The ANC ruling party, to be blunt about it. So they're caught in a tricky situation as well. But what I find, hypocritical about a lot of the academics who, I have great respect for, and I've worked with a lot of them, and, I've cited a lot of them in all my work, is that they propose very radical visions for the rest of Africa and for the global South. When they get up there and give lectures and when they're traveling the world, and I've been there and I've seen them and I've taken very seriously what they had to say, they propose new ways of doing things based on the kinds of societies we live in. For us to aspire towards a kind of first world model, leave aside all the ridiculous sort of aspirations in terms of the sustainability debate, right? Which already says we should not go along that kind of developmental route. But just look at it plainly from the perspective of, our societies have a different history and are essentially largely dual economies. There are parts of East, West, and Central Africa where up to 80% of the urban economies are actually informal. And this has everything to do with colonialism and the colonial project, which basically created a formal economy for settlers through which they could exploit resources and enrich Europe in particular. And the informal economies, which is, if you look at the traditional colonial city, was the bazaar, where the natives, essentially, who only had customary rights and not civic rights, which is what the settlers had, could go about their business and not interfere with the real economy. So just as a starting point, most of the academics argue that in our economic frameworks, we should start thinking about informal economy and incorporating it into our thinking. We should start trying to find ways of dealing with it sensitively instead of, the mass eradication schemes that we have, the persecution of the informal sector. A lot of corruption goes on with policemen and officials who are supposed to regulate them from the state. So they have this bold kind of new way of thinking, which they expect us to go out and make real. It's the kind of proposals they make to governments, the proposals to the next generation like myself. But when it comes to their own institution, when it's challenged by very similar realities, is that most of our students can't actually afford to see their way through this kind of education system, which is very, very expensive, especially the top universities. They retract into essentially what is the logic of the establishment. And then, sort of invoke the specter of the destruction of the entire system and the loss of our competitiveness on the global stage. And I just felt like, they needed to basically be able to take a bit of their own medicine. You can't be making such bold recommendations for how we deal with these problems to governments across the world in the global South and not be able to think of your own situation in Europe. So, what I wrote was more of an appeal to them to start taking seriously their own ideas about change. And if they say they are for the struggles of the students, if they are for the agenda of the students, then let's put our heads together and start figuring out how to do this instead of picking at straws and finding, in any protest, whether it's an Occupy protest, whether it's Arab Spring, wherever it is, there are going to be disparate elements. There's going to be a bit of violence. There are going to be some problems. But to use those as excuses for not actually dealing with the fundamental issue, I found unconscionable, which is why I wrote that in that piece, and it's been used by a lot of people. Admittedly, I didn't write that piece in as balanced a way as I would usually have written a piece. But I suppose my emotions were very strongly caught up in it, given my own history.
Well, I mean, to that point, I think that we should have a kind of willingness to abide emotionality as being capable of informing what we're saying in a positive way, because the other side of that is the objectivity is fundamentally a myth, right? Which actually,
yes, absolutely.
Okay, it comes back to the polyvalence of perspective, the polyvalence of perspective that we can bring to bear on any situation. It also connects with several other points in our conversation prior, right? In terms of like the space of a new imagining, and the academic establishment has to be willing to enter into that space with the students, which is kind of crazy because we don't know what's on the other side of that engagement, right? You might have some ideas. There's some anticipation.
Well, I think that they've got to keep that process open, and as broad as have a broad as a participatory process as possible, and deal with the complexities that emerge in it. There's going to be tensions, but that's the difficult part of leadership, and that's why I talk so much about leaders in Lazarus. I wrote so much about it. Because leadership is not just providing a vision and writing a whole lot of policy documents and saying this is our economic growth path. It's precisely about being able to lead us through change, precisely from a place of discomfort or even comfort into a new space, which is actually important not just for us, but for future generations. For me, that's real leadership.
It just struck me as you're speaking, a point of connection there between the notion of leadership, or rather a point of disconnection, right? Between the notion of leadership as is traditionally conceived and the idea of freedom is something which occurs in community or in concept, right? So traditionally, when we think of a leader, we think of a person or a set of persons who occupy a space of privilege in a hierarchy, right? And they sort of are driving the train. But if you sort of return to the idea that freedom is something which occurs in a fundamentally egalitarian and conversational space, it decenters
absolutely
the phenomenon of leadership from affixation with any given individual and becomes something which emerges from a group. So if the students are leading. There's not a student or a group of students who lead, it's the group, and that social connection with the advancement of a certain set of ideals, which may be messy, but which are, creating kinesis. That's where to sort of really put one's energy, right?
One way of looking at it is the difference between your evangelical Christian or other evangelical religions, and for example, what used to be the Swami order in India, so in Hinduism, where the evangelist tradition is to go out and actively campaign for people to come to God, and to give them a set of principles and a set of things to believe in, and to convince them and coerce them even into the fold. The Swami order is completely different. It's when you're ready for spiritual development, you come along to the Swami, and the Swami facilitates your development. He doesn't have all the answers, doesn't have every single prescription, but is, more like a therapist in a sense, who can help you through a difficult process and come out on the other side, a bit more whole and a bit more intact and a bit more capable. And I think that's the kind of leadership I'm talking about, the leaders as facilitators, exactly as you put it, to allow that conversation to be conducted in a way that the new can emerge from it. So there's, that's a nice way of thinking about it. And it's a way I often think about it. It's a difference between the kind of evangelical tradition, as your populist leaders do or your rhetoricians do, and the kind of leaders that I grew up around who worked in communities, going door to door, speaking to uncle so-and-so and auntie so-and-so and being asked ranges of difficult questions. Even community meetings that I grew up in, you'd have the weirdest old guy standing up asking the most outrageous questions, and the leaders would deal with it in such a patient way because they understood the society we came from. They were sensitive to it, and they could, help coax that person into the right direction, but not judge them.
Right.
So the truth can emerge from that conversation, and it can be relative, rather than having a leader who says, this is the truth and this is the way we need to do things.
I think what's we may be sort of wrapping it up here soon because we're coming up on the hour. But I think that the other sort of background is a capacity to trust, right? That we can actually trust ourselves and we can actually trust each other, right? And that, if you have that, which is, I guess, kind of embodied in solidarity, that has like an enormous power, right? And maybe what the challenge is in terms of, encouraging people who have a situation within the establishment is to say, you can trust yourself not to have to be reliant on what's going on, because that's what's really going on, is that they're afraid, and sometimes, quite plausibly afraid of endangering their own livelihood, but if there's a kind of active faith involved, we can move beyond that, right? What do you think about that?
I think, the opportunity for us now, to move beyond one of the features of the condition of modern man, which is the excessive individuation, is larger than it's been in recent history, precisely because we've got the virtual realm within which we can have those conversations as communities, which we no longer have face-to-face anymore. In the society I grew up in, we all got together in our community center or at churches or in big venues or stadiums to discuss and to work out the politics that we wanted. Nowadays, that doesn't exist in a lot of modern societies, but there are these other vehicles through which these conversations are going on. I mean, Noam Chomsky spoke about it in the late 90s. So it's not a new thinking, but it is maturing right now, these opportunities. So I would say the fear that people in power have over things they don't control and conversations they don't control is what they need to overcome. And become part of the conversation is what they need to do. And if they are able to do that, they will be the successful leaders of tomorrow, because I really believe that there are some fundamental changes beyond just the economic impacts of the information economy, which are going to influence our politics in a very real and meaningful way, and may even change the kinds of democracies we have and make leaders much more answerable and make them much more in contact with people on a more regular basis, so that democracy can be exercised in very real terms, more regularly, voting on even issues around whether we want a mass public transit system in our city or we want to build more roads. I think even on issues like that, we can have the engagement of the broader public. And in doing so, we will strengthen democracy. That I think is the opportunity that's there for us now. And I think the fear and the lack of trust is really from those at the top, towards those at the bottom. But from what I see, looking from the bottom, is
Well,
I see
I
an
mean-
amazing amount of collaboration.
I think you're pretty spot on. And in fact, you already can see that. It's like, for example, in the relative success of like the Sanders campaign here in the U.S., right? The fact that he's been able to resist the
Absolutely.
establishment candidate so effectively is, I think, is very intimately related with virtual connection. But of course, this raises another
Yes.
challenge because you don't want to lose the intimacy of physical space. But that opens up
Yeah.
a whole other ball of wax. So we're just going to set that aside for the moment since we're coming up on the hour, right? Let me ask you, maybe you want to make sort of like a closing remark or something to that effect, since we have to wrap it up here in a minute. I'm sorry to exhibit a real.
I think, the one thing that I'd like to say about, Lazarus and the multiple in particular is it was never meant to be a prescriptive work. I was never trying to construct some kind of grand theory into which society could fit. My main intentions for that piece of work was to empower people with a set of conceptual thinking tools that they can go out and envision the kind of world they want for themselves. And so I focused on trying to deal with the complexities that we face and to give people a language, which I found very useful in my own work, to be able to grapple with their different contexts and their different challenges and come up with solutions that they want. So, if I had to say anything in closing, it would be that, I'm not looking to change the world through establishing a grand new vision for it. It's more about giving power to people to be able to think about the world differently and act upon it differently.
But it's a facilitating.
Absolutely.
volume.
Exactly.
Well, thank see what I did there?
Very good.
Well, thank you so much, Cameron. We could actually talk for like another 2 hours, but time and space
it was a
and all that. So, I'll have this up later on today, and I'll send you the links, etc.
Cool.
So,
that was a pleasure. And I've got to go back to babysitting now. I've got a 7-month-old kid here.
all right. Thank you again, and have a lovely evening. I'll talk to you soon.
Take care, Thomas. Cheers.
Ciao.
Bye.
Bye.
Every once in a while, I get something like super interesting, like maybe